think I'll be focusing mainly on, as you know, I'm based at CREM, Center for Research in Ethnic Minority Entrepreneurship, but I've also done a PhD looking at disabled entrepreneurs, and so I thought I'll actually focus on, talking more about disabled entrepreneurs specifically, just because I'm kind of closer to that area. So I guess my main interest in disabled entrepreneurs started when I graduated, and I got a job at Kingston University at Small Business Research Center. And at the time, I was working as a research assistant, and I was encouraged to do a PhD. And I was looking at, what could I focus on, and I found that there was a lot of literature looking at different groups of underrepresented and disadvantaged entrepreneurs, including women, migrants, ethnic minorities, and so on. But I found that there was very little on disability. And my main kind of interest came from, really, I had some prior experience of disability. So I used to work in social care. I worked with a young disabled woman who really had a lot of negative experience in trying to find and keep a job. And I also, personally had experience with my younger sister having a disability and really kind of struggling to keep a job. So I had this interest in disability, and when I came to Kingston, I thought there was really a big gap in knowledge in understanding disabled entrepreneurs. So I decided to focus on that, and my PhD looked at, and I was really kind of interested in what happens when those two identities come together, being disabled and being an entrepreneur, or wanting to become an entrepreneur. What happens when those two identities kind of come together? So that became the focus of my PhD. Yes. So as I said, my PhD, so in a way there's kind of, I guess, three key areas, three key contributions that I think my research has made. So first of all, thinking about disability entrepreneurship, I started my PhD 10 years ago, and there has been more and more, encouragingly, there's been more and more interest in the topic. But, 10 years ago, there was very little on the topic. So it was still, very under-researched area. And so my main contribution from my PhD has been to just shed more, insights into disabled peoples and people with long-term health conditions, into their experiences of starting and running a business in the UK. And particularly looking at, with my PhD, looking at, how disability shapes their motivations and capacity to commit to venture creation, and also how disability can be a source of ideas for products and services. And finally, the final kind of key aspect of my PhD was, I was really particularly interested in relationships and how disabled entrepreneurs develop relationships with customers, employees, and other stakeholders, and how do they kind of build and gain legitimacy. So those were the kind of, I would say, three key areas within kind of disability entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship more widely, literature. But my PhD kind of asked the question of how do disabled people form entrepreneurial identity. So one of the kind of key contributions is also to entrepreneurial identity literature, which is, which includes, various studies looking at kind of the question of who is and how one becomes an entrepreneur. And so through my PhD, what I found when looking at the literature is that the existing kind of perspectives on that question really didn't help me answer my main research question. And so I developed a new conceptualization, a new kind of perspective on what is entrepreneurial identity and how do therefore disabled people become entrepreneurs. And within that, more specifically, what I found within the literature is that there is this, I think there's this kind of two dominant perspectives on the question of who is and how one becomes an entrepreneur. One which kind of emphasizes, personality characteristics, and on one hand, and on the other hand, there is a literature that kind of talks about how entrepreneurial identity is a process of becoming, and and how that's kind of enacted through narrative practices. But that didn't kind of really fit with, didn't really help me explain what I was seeing from my experience talking to disabled entrepreneurs, and particularly because I was seeing the kind of influence of how different types of impairments and health conditions shape the experience of starting and running a business. And because that literature really kind of under theorizes the body, so I'd say one of the key contributions of my PhD has been to bring the body, impaired or otherwise, into studies of entrepreneurship. Recognizing that whether somebody has an impairment or health condition doesn't determine whether they become an entrepreneur, but it is an important aspect, and it importantly shapes the experience of entrepreneurship. So I'll stop it there. And actually, another key contribution of my current ongoing research is looking at disabled entrepreneurs in relation to enterprise policy, looking at enterprise policy and support for disabled entrepreneurs. And more specifically, I've been interested in the role of the welfare system and how that shapes people's experiences. I thought about this question just before the interview, and I thought about three kind of key challenges that I experienced in doing research in the area of disability and entrepreneurship. So the first one was for me because when I started my PhD, I thought there wasn't much research on the topic, and I wanted to understand what disability was and wanted to understand the different experiences of people. And so one of the key challenges was kind of wanting to be representative of disabled entrepreneurs. And disabled entrepreneurs are a very diverse group in terms of impairment type, severity, the onset of impairment or an injury that kind of causes disability. And so I wanted to really kind of ensure that I've spoken to people from diverse backgrounds, but not only of people with diverse experience of disability, but also kind of wider characteristics. And in a way, I think I've been quite successful in doing that with my PhD, but I think it's also been a challenge in reaching some groups of entrepreneurs. And, I feel like I've learned a lot on my journey, but I'm still learning so much, and there's still so much I don't know. So for instance, how to communicate with people with particular, impairments or health conditions. So for instance, people with hearing impairments, or people more broadly with sensory impairments. And so it's been a kind of a big learning experience for me, and I think a challenge as well in some sense. I think the second key challenge was to, as with most research that you do, with most qualitative research, was to kind of build trust and legitimacy with the study participants. And I say that as I say that as someone who is I had this interest in disability because of my kind of personal experience of disability, but I say that as someone who is a non-disabled researcher. And so going out doing research with disabled entrepreneurs, I think it wasn't that anybody questioned my kind of credibility as a researcher, but it was more I guess me being self-conscious of being a non-disabled researcher, wanting to talk about disability, and feeling that maybe people would kind of question my motives, I suppose. So that was probably more of a kind of internal challenge. And the final kind of key challenge that I think I experienced during my research was this kind of, I guess, emotional impact of research. So, doing research on disability, I've spoken to, to people to people who may have had, very traumatic experiences, either, because they've had an accident or an injury, and then they went through that process of kind of coming to terms with disability and getting used to their identity as a disabled person, and then, or maybe having some negative experiences of employment or even self-employment. And so there was a lot of, very hard traumatic experiences that people had, and that kind of affects you as a researcher as well. So I think that was one of the kind of key challenges. I think that disability entrepreneurship is still a very much under-researched topic compared to, if you look at some of the other groups, some other groups of entrepreneurs that there has been a focus on, including ethnic minority and migrant entrepreneurs or women entrepreneurs. So there is still very little research on, on disabled entrepreneurs. And just recently, I've been doing a review of ethnic minority business literature, which kind of really made me realize what a massive kind of knowledge gap there is in our understanding of this group. So, for instance, things like, social and economic contribution of disabled entrepreneurs in the UK, the barriers they face in accessing markets, in accessing labor, in accessing finance. There is very little, or nothing almost on those areas. Also, I think, we don't really know that much about disabled entrepreneurs' business support needs. And I think your project contributes to that, but kind of trying to understand what support is out there and, how can we create best conditions for disabled people and people with long-term health conditions who want to become entrepreneurs. So looking more at support and more specifically there, something that I've started working on and I want to continue in future is looking at the role of the welfare state in supporting disabled entrepreneurs. So that's something that came up as an important issue through my PhD. And I think it will continue being quite an important issue, particularly now with, we've had the impact of COVID-19 and we've seen how much the state had to kind of step in to support small businesses, to support vulnerable self-employed people, through different schemes, including welfare support. And so I think, welfare system will continue to be quite important, when thinking about enterprise policy and support. Just to give you an example of that, I think universal credit has been kind of rolled out throughout the UK, but there is very little research to understand how that is impacting. We know that it's having impacts on different groups, but there is very little understanding on how it affects self-employed people, and particularly self-employed people who are vulnerable. So I'll stop with that. I think that's enough.